What you said in The Sun, less Islam. Surely less Islam means less people of the Muslim faith. That means
left extremism. When it comes to jihadist extremism, jihadism comes from Islam. Therefore, if it's 1%, 5%, 15% of people of the Muslim faith who follow that version of it, you've got a hell of a problem.
When this BBC host invited Douglas Murray for an appearance, he didn't know he was setting himself up for a total catastrophe. Because the whole session was following proper etiquette right up until the moment it didn't.
Now, in your book, you talk about how Hamas is a pro-death cult movement, and you talk about how some of their language has been absorbed in the West. You talk about those protests taking place at US and indeed UK universities, and you're saying that if the West is not careful, I think you talk about how this misplaced Western sympathy could embolden forces that perpetuate a culture of violence. What do you mean by that?
Well, Hamas is self-confessedly a death cult. It worships death, it glorifies in death, it praises and seeks death. In the aftermath of October 7th, many people passed over Hamas's actions and got straight onto the issue of the Israeli counteraction. I didn't want the realities, the facts of what happened on the 7th to get lost in any way. Many people have done great reporting and journalism in the aftermath of that atrocity to put together what happened that day. But I spent most of the last 8
The setup is familiar. Extremism is acknowledged but immediately quarantined as a distortion, an outlier, something imported from elsewhere. The moral posture is clear. Harmony is the goal, while division is the sin, and anyone who disrupts that balance must be handled carefully.
Speaking to families, speaking to survivors, going around the hospitals, the morgues even, and finding out from the people hiding in their homes, from people who were slaughtering their relatives, right the way up through the Israeli war cabinet and much more. I've tried to piece together what happened on the day. And then my first-hand account of the war that has resulted. But the third thing, which the book is really about, which goes to your question, is that I believe that something has been revealed in our own societies in the West, in Britain and America and elsewhere, which is deeply concerning. This was an attack by a death cult on a democracy. The slaughter of 1,200 people in the most barbaric fashion, the taking of 250 hostages, stealing them from their homes and holding them and torturing them, some still there, like 21-year-old Edan Alexander from New Jersey. And
Douglas Murray walked into that session already casted as the disruptor. Not because he denies Muslim suffering or excuses violence against civilians, he explicitly doesn't, but because he refuses to play the comforting game of abstraction.
Cult attacked the citizens of a liberal democracy like ours, and instead of siding with the liberal democracy, many people in countries like Britain sided with the death cult. They sided with Hamas.
What Murray does consistently is collapse distance. He takes ideas that are usually discussed in the passive voice, such as radicalization occurred, communities were failed, mistakes were made, and ties them back to decisions, doctrines, and consequences. That is deeply attached to uncomfortable television. Because once you do that, someone in the room has to own the implications.
Obviously writing about this issue for 10, 20 years or so, and writing about Islamic extremism in this country. And in 2017, after the Manchester Arena bombing, you talked about, because of that threat of Islamic extremism, we should have less Islam in this country. Was that a wise phrase, talking about less Islam?
Notice the moment the host pivots to less Islam. On paper, it's a semantic clarification. In practice, it's a moral trap. The phrase is deliberately flattened until it can only be heard as less Muslims, at which point the accusation of bigotry becomes almost automatic. Murray resists the framing entirely, but that resistance is precisely what freezes the conversation. Because now the host is no longer moderating a discussion, he's defending a narrative boundary. Notice how the host attempted to put words in his mouth. But Douglas isn't ready to accept that erroneous reinterpretation and distortion of his earlier statement. Because once he allowed him to run him down, it would have been disastrous. Once you accept that, certain questions become unaskable. Why do specific forms of religious extremism recur in specific ideological traditions? Why do some doctrines generate apologetic faster than reform? Why do liberal democracies extend infinite interpretive charity to belief systems that explicitly reject liberal premises?
this country has had a wildly stupid and lax immigration policy for decades. And we allowed people like the Abedi family, a family of jihadists who'd fallen out with Colonel Gaddafi because they were from rival jihadist groups. When the Abedi family fell out with Colonel Gaddafi, they came first to London and then to Manchester. And one of the sons they gave this country was Salman Abedi, who at the age of 22 killed 22 young girls at the Manchester Arena with a suicide bomb. One, by the way, for every year of life this country gave him. His brothers just stabbed and thrown boiling oil at 3 prison wards. Let me bear with you. Why were the Abedi, hang on, why were the Abedi family in the UK? Why is nobody interested?
Murray's question about numbers are clumsy to some ears, but blunt to others, and that is really a question about scale and risk. If even a small percentage of a large population subscribes to a violent worldview, the downstream effects are not hypothetical. That isn't stereotyping, it's arithmetic. But arithmetic has no feelings, and modern broadcasting is built around feelings.
And I'll tell you what the problem here is. There are lots of types of extremism. You get far-right extremism, far-left extremism. When it comes to jihadist extremism, jihadism comes from Islam. Therefore, if it's 1%, 5%, 15% of people of the Muslim faith who follow that version of it, you've got a hell of a problem. And the more people, the larger, this is simple math, the larger the number of people who are followers of a faith that has not solved the extremism problem in its midst or drawn suitable lines, the more extremism you will have. You don't get that from the Catholic Church in 2023 or 4. You don't get it from the Methodists. You won't get it from the Quakers, and you won't get it from the Anglican Church.
Of course there is a problem with fundamentalism and Islamic extremism.
And fundamentalist Islam comes from
Islam, you're saying less of everyone, which means less Sajid David,
no, it doesn't.
less Sadiq Khan.
No,
and you're stereotyping.
The BBC host's response is revealing not for what it says, but for what it avoids. No one meaningfully challenges Murray's factual claims about jihadist ideology. No one disputes the historical record he invokes. Instead, the counterargument becomes emotional optics. How would a law-abiding British Muslim feel hearing this? As if discomfort itself is a refutation.
Sajid. No, of course it's not stereotyping. I mean, this is a kind of dated conversation to my mind, because this is all being addressed elsewhere as we speak. Nobody else is as incredibly slow in learning as the British media and political class when it comes to this problem. Why is it the case that Saturday after Saturday we have thousands of people going through major British cities who support the death cults who would murder Jews and the rest of us next? That's a question you and I and Newsnight should answer.
Douglas Murray, thank you for talking to Newsnight.
At this point, the host runs off because he no longer has any more point to buttress, and he knows that even if he had, it would be practically useless and ineffective. So the host had to end the conversation there, hovering between moral condemnation and procedural defensiveness. And even his next set of panelists didn't help either.
That was Douglas Murray talking to me earlier. Joe, I mean, you'll presumably agree with Douglas Murray that there is a problem with Islamic extremism. We all want to combat that. But what did you think of what he had to say about less Islam?
Well, I think you were charitable in saying that he was talking to you earlier. I mean, he was sneering in a very self-satisfied way with a extreme arrogance. I think, frankly, his contribution there was actually about sowing division, about trying to pit groups of people against each other. There is no contradiction, nor should anyone say that there is, between being appalled at the acts of October the 7th, of the atrocities that Hamas carried out, and also being appalled at the violence meted out to children in Gaza hospitals. I think most people watching this show would feel appalled and horrified at both of those circumstances. And part of the problem here is when people are told they have to choose a side. Actually, this is about whether or not you're taking the side of division or whether or not you want to have the side of people getting along and, you know, living alongside one another in a country, as most people want to do and as mostly happens. And I think, frankly, the message that he is peddling is one of division that is deeply unhealthy.
This isn't really about Islam being peaceful or violent. It's about whether liberal societies are capable of self-examination without collapsing into either guilt or denial.
I think that Douglas Murray has a point. He talks about how we have a wildly stupid and relaxed immigration policy that has meant that fundamentalists have come to this country, have been fostered in this country by some organisations. Do you think he has a point, or do you have a problem with him talking about less Islam?
Well, I mean, I think that the idea that we only get extremists from abroad is not accurate or borne out by the facts. And I think he makes an interesting point about like how well we integrate. I think that was sort of the point he was trying to make about integration as a society and how we can better understand one another. But honestly, it felt like quite a lot of that was not explained in terms of, this is his view, that maths apparently accounts for the fact that there might be some people that are extremists, therefore all the people that belong to that group in the broader sense, there should be less of them. I just don't think is an argument that is really about bringing people together or even trying to come up with a solution.
And Matthew, Donald Trump is quite keen on Douglas Murray, my friend.
He certainly is. He's been promoting his book. Douglas Murray is a man who has said of Humza Yousaf, who was the First Minister of Scotland, that he had infiltrated the British political system. Humza Yousaf is someone who was born in Britain, born in Scotland. This man is an extremist, in my view, and the Overton window, which we talked about earlier, has shifted so significantly that, and I don't criticise Newsnight for doing it, that he has been given an 8-minute interview on prime BBC television. And that is concerning because more and more people, it seems to me, share his repulsive views. Imagine, just for a moment, Nick, being one of the millions of British Muslims, law-abiding British Muslims, watching him say those things.
We did question him.
But that wouldn't be the only time a TV host behaved rudely towards Murray simply because he said something they didn't like about Islam. Let's watch this.
Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. And now to speak against the motion, Douglas Murray. He's a best-selling author and founder and director of the Center for Social Cohesion, also a citizen of the United Kingdom, a member of the Church of England. Until recently, you said that your study of the Quran, you said this in print, made you an atheist.
That's right. I said Muhammad made me an atheist. The publisher said at the time, that's a pretty provocative headline. I said, well, get somebody to do the next one. She said, I could find a Catholic who could say Muhammad made me a Catholic. I said, how about trying to make it a 3-part article and get the third one, somebody saying Muhammad made me a Jew? And that one would be the trouble.
Douglas Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry to make this panel rather Brit-centric after my colleague Majid. This isn't an attempt by us to have a British takeover of the old colony or anything like that.
The reason Murray is often labeled as extreme is not only because his views are seen as repulsive, but also because he forces many people to now hear arguments they were previously shielded from.
I was coming earlier from my own fallen empire, referring back to my friend and colleague Ayan's comments earlier, and I was reading the paper, as I'm sure all of you were doing earlier today. Majid finished his comments by talking about the importance of changing paradigms. I'm not sure this is about paradigms. I think it's about facts. Here are some facts in my newspaper earlier. The Times Square bomber, of course, a man just up the road from here who tried to kill thousands of people. Only, by the way, didn't manage it because he set the 24-hour timing device to 7 a.m. instead of 7 p.m. 1900 hours was what it was meant to be. If he had have got that bit right, thousands of New Yorkers would have died earlier this year again. I see further in the paper 12 suspects arrested in France in a network trying to recruit people to go and fight American and other troops in Afghanistan. I turn to another page of the newspaper in the city I've just flown off from this morning, a Muslim London Underground worker who was had written to his wife, who was off to try to become a martyr for Allah, as he says. He says, more than anything, I wish Allah to grant me martyrdom. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at facts. We should also just quickly, if I may, refer something to the wording of tonight's debate. Ayan's already mentioned this, but I mean, let me put it this way. You're I'm sure, a liberal-minded New York audience, or at least I hope you are. We'll see. But I imagine that if the motion we had here tonight was Christianity is a religion of peace, we get to the Q&A, perhaps even before, and somebody would say, if the other side were arguing for that, somebody would say, what about the Crusades? What about that? And then there'd be some other clever clogs who'd say, what about that Florida pastor the other week? That was a nasty business. That's Christianity for you. If we'd had tonight, Judaism is a religion of peace, the other side were trying to argue that.
The implication is clear. The danger is not the ideology being discussed, but the discussion itself.
Anything. There'd be people popping up in the hall tonight saying, oh, there's this bit in one of the Old Testament books, really, really bad. All sorts of massacres going on. Why don't you talk about that? There might even be people trying to say that the argument that Judaism was a religion of peace couldn't be argued because people would say, look at what Israel is doing, and isn't that a direct response, and so on. So let's not have a debate about Islam and whether or not Islam is a religion of peace without talking about the facts to do with Islam. It's an absurd situation we're in, where nothing that anyone does whilst being Muslim is any responsibility of Islam's. Yet anything anyone does whilst being a Christian or a Jew is responsibility of all Christians, all Jews. Let's make this as straightforward as I can. Take the categorization that eminent scholars like Bernard Lewis, Ibn Waraq have made. Let's say Islam is a very, very complex thing. And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have three Islams. Islam 1, 2 and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran and so on, is bad.
What this exchange exposes is the collision between a slogan and a record. The motion begins with reassurance. Islam is a religion of peace. But Murray refuses to argue paradigms or intentions. Instead, he insists on evidence.
There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. Takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still, no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now. Thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, but old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. Now look, I wish that Zebra and Majid were the spokespeople of Islam. It would be lovely, although in Majid's case it would have taken rather too long if everyone had to go for 14 years preaching the downfall of America and then said, no, not so much. But we are where we are. Anyhow, I wish they spoke for Islam. It would be great. But the fact is that tonight, the organisers of this debate asked a number of clerics. None of them would show. Specifically, they wouldn't show and debate against Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Myself, I don't think they cared. But no, it's very interesting that they will not debate. Time and again, the actual leaders of your religion will not debate this. And you're left with people like we have here. The reason why is, of course, is that the leaders of the religion show such terrible lesson.
What he's pointing at is the recent cases of jihadist violence, not as abstractions, but as contemporary facts that happened in real cities to real people. His central claim isn't that Muslims are violent, yet Islam is still treated unlike every other religion. When violence is committed by Muslims, Islam is declared irrelevant. When violence is committed by Christians or Jews, their faiths are put on trial immediately.
Not a small thing. It's not as it were a detail. It's not like a wacky Florida pastor. That you've got the largest Sunni state of Saudi Arabia, the most important Sunni state in the world, the most extraordinary closed prison of a society. It's not a detail, it's not a one-off nut job. The Shiite Republic of Iran is what it is, led by the people it's led by. That is not an accident, it's not a detail. The thing that worries me is that although tonight we hear from the fellow panelists here about how Islam is a religion of peace, the fact is that the people who are making the decisions in the religion, the people who are preaching in the religion, the heads of that religion, people like Sheikh Qaradawi, who broadcasts anti-Semitic the most appalling filth every week on the main networks. That is the faith that's speaking for you guys. I wish that, Ziba, you were on every week on Al Jazeera, but you're not. Karadar.
He is of the opinion that the texts and legal tradition are overtly violent, while modern Muslims are peaceful precisely because they ignore much of them. That gap, he says, is the real issue. Calling Islam peaceful isn't analysis, it's hope dressed up as fact.
The problem is that Islam is an unstable component, as a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
Tell you what, the media will never allow this kind of rhetoric on air because they know what it means. And they aren't after exposing the truth or engaging with sincerity. Because you know why? To engage honestly would risk validating concerns long dismissed as impolite. What do you think about Douglas Murray's views on Islam? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.